Hey everyone, welcome to Kira's History Tour. I'm gonna have to get a better intro at some point, forgive me. Today's episode is on, as you probably guessed from the title, Cleopatra. I'm kidding, it is Henry VII. I debated doing that joke, that was so bad, I'm sorry. Okay, but why, may you ask, are you focusing on Henry VII? Why not literally any other king? I don't know, maybe his much more fascinating, probably a lot more well-known son, Henry VIII. And I will say, why not? Also, because I did a project on Henry VII, so I already had quite a bit of the research. But joking aside, I decided to do this episode because Henry VII was/is actually, at least from what I could tell, a crucial figure in English history, and as you will come to find out, may have a reputation that doesn't fully encompass his reign. Without further ado, I guess. Hey guys, before we begin, Future Kira here. I just wanted to say real quick that apologies, I actually do go quite fast during this episode. So I'm definitely just going to try to slow down in future ones. And also just some quick pronunciation. It is Plantagenet in terms of the houses, and it's Calwalder or Calawardir, something like that. In terms of the Welsh symbol, that was bugging me. But yeah, hope you enjoy. So, Henry VII was born January 28th, 1457, and was the King of England and Lord of Ireland from August 1485 to April 1509. He was the first monarch of the House of Tudor. It may be helpful to know some background info before we get into all the war and king stuff. I would recommend looking up a family tree of the House of Tudor, or the House of Plantagenet. I'll also try to put one up on my Instagram if I find a good one, but there are a lot of names and a lot of mistresses, so it's really helpful to have one, to look one up. Henry's rise to power starts during the Wars of the Roses. Both the House of Lancaster and the House of York, the two families fighting for the crown, were branches of the House of Plantagenet. Henry comes from the House of Tudor, which is a royal house of Welsh origin, however claimed to be a descendant of the House of Lancaster. His maternal grandfather was Owen Tudor, second husband of Catherine of Valois, a Welshman and founder of the Tudor dynasty. Seriously, I would recommend looking up a family tree. This Welsh origin actually later proved helpful to Henry, as he used it to attract military support and gain safe passage through Wales later in life. He also occasionally flew the Red Dragon of, and forgive me for butchering this name, Cadwallader, an Old Welsh symbol. But back to the battle for the throne, Henry originally had little claim, as any royalty was passed down through his mother and through questionable circumstances, including a few mistresses and a marriage law. Essentially, Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother and descendant of King Edward III, wasn't technically a legitimate heir. She was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Although an Act of Parliament legalized the marriage between the two, it didn't give any of the children any inheritance to the throne. Skipping ahead a few years, the Battle of Tewkesbury is what sets a lot of Henry's life in motion. What was a major point in the War of the Roses was also a disaster for the House of Lancaster, and essentially led to the House of York rising to power. In case you're wondering, you probably aren't, a very quick summary of Tewkesbury. Edward, Prince of Wales and heir to the Lancaster throne, dies, and Edward IV, a Yorkist, finds himself securely on the throne. With a Yorkish king, Henry flees, or is exiled, and ends up under the protection of Francis II, Duke of Brittany. Henry originally tried to land in France, wasn't able to, obviously, some weather issues, some other things, and Henry remains in exile for 14 years. During this time, some stuff happens. Most importantly, Henry VI is found dead. He's killed, probably. And then in 1483, Edward IV dies, leaving his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as his protector, and puts his two young sons, Edward and Richard, again, that family tree really coming into handy, into Richard, Duke of Gloucester's care. Was that a mistake? Yes. Stick around to find out more. What happens is that instead of Edward, the eldest son, being coronated, Richard, the Duke, is coronated instead and becomes Richard III. Yes, like the Shakespeare play, kinda at least. The infamous Richard III now has the throne, and the two boys, now more commonly known as the Princes in the Tower, disappear. They're probably killed. In fact, I believe some bones were found like in a box stuffed in one of the walls of like the Tower of London or something. I'm not 100% sure if they're the princes, but it's commonly assumed that Richard may have had them killed. So now Henry has suddenly become the only male surviving heir with at least a semi-legitimate claim to the throne, and he becomes the natural opposition to Richard III, and his rise to power begins. With Henry's popularity starting to grow, it became important for him to stand against Richard III. So, Henry tries to land in England in October of 1483 to begin a revolt and stand against Richard. It fails. This was Buckingham's rebellion, an attempt started by Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, in an attempt to overthrow Richard III. A mix of bad weather and bad timing set this rebellion up to fail. Richard was already facing backlash, and so was on high alert for any potential usurpers, which led Buckingham's plot to being discovered and shut down. Buckingham was surrounded and captured by Richard's men, and was executed on November 2nd. And Henry was actually almost caught as well. He was about to land, but saw Richard's men waiting for him and abandoned the plot. With the two main leaders gone, the uprising failed. Once having returned home, Henry, by promising to marry Elizabeth York should he be crowned king, who was the eldest daughter of Edward IV and heiress to the House of York, continued to unite the houses of York and Lancaster. The French king Charles VII also backed Henry in his rise to power. His rise finally culminates in the Battle of Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth Field was the last significant battle of the Wars of the Roses and, spoiler alert, leads to Henry establishing the Tudor dynasty. Warning, there are a lot of similar names coming up, so essentially this is between Richard III, a Yorkist king, and Henry VII, representing the Lancastrian forces, and this is considered the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. This battle begins when Henry crosses the English Channel in 1485, without incident this time, and lands in Wales and begins marching inland. As Richard was made aware of Henry's landing and began to gather troops, Henry was getting support as he headed for London. An important ally, and I say that in quotes, Henry met with was Lord Thomas Stanley. He presumably met to ask for support. It's interesting, though, because although the Stanleys were predominantly Lancastrians, Thomas Stanley was noticeably not very loyal. In fact, none of his actions suggested that he would fight against Richard. He later gets overshadowed by his brother, Sir William Stanley, anyways. Finally, on August 22nd, 1485, the Lancasters and the Yorks face off somewhere near Ambion Hill, a marshy battleground. Richard III had the superior army, numbering about 15,000 men. Henry Tudor had about 5,000 men and no military experience. Lord Thomas Stanley and Sir William Stanley had about 6,000 men between them. At this point, no one really knows whose side they're on. Both Stanleys were originally loyal to Richard III, at least once he became king. However, Sir William Stanley did actually do something during the battle, and his decisive action to fight for, can you guess, Henry VII helped win the battle in favor of Henry. He was later rewarded for his efforts. Lord Thomas Stanley, on the other hand, didn't do much, from what I could find. To give him some slack, Richard III was holding one of his sons under threat of being beheaded if Thomas fought for the wrong side. On the other hand, there are accounts that when threatened with his son's death, Thomas Stanley replied, quote, "I have 3 other sons, so judge him as you will." So yes, Henry VII was definitely the underdog. Because of his lack of military experience, Henry left John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, to lead Henry's vanguard, the advancement, while Henry stayed behind the defences. Oxford's skill during the battle definitely helped turn the tide of war. He managed to navigate the marsh in the middle of the field and attacked Richard's men from the front line, which was led by John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, who was meant to lead Richard's rearguard, emphasis on meant to, failed to engage in battle. Now, historians debate whether it was for personal reasons, i.e. he was questioning loyalty, or if he was simply unable to engage due to the difficult terrain. Now, with Northumberland essentially deserting Richard's men, and with Oxford beating back Richard's front line, Richard began to lose. Several men on Richard's side noticed this as well and fled. I think Richard at some point was offered a horse to flee as well and refused, saying that he'd rather die a king. Likely realizing how badly the battle was going, Richard decided to try and kill Henry. Seeing Henry behind some defenses, Richard charges, likely with somewhere between 200 and 800 men. There are a lot of different accounts on this number. Richard almost ended the battle right then and there. He managed to kill Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, i.e. Richard III got really, and I mean really close to killing Henry, like one person over. A small group of men managed to slow Richard down enough after this killing to buy time for Henry to hide. Eventually, Richard was surrounded by guards and got away from Richard and his men. Richard's group started to become surrounded and overwhelmed and were being pushed back near the marshes. At this site, Sir William Stanley, the actual helpful Stanley, rushed into battle on Henry's side, fully outnumbering Richard's men. Soon, nearly all of Richard's men had fallen, and Richard himself was killed with a blow to the head. His body was later publicly displayed to prove his death. News of Richard's death spread quickly, and many of Richard's remaining troops, including Northumberland, fled. Henry was crowned king on August 22nd, 1485, the same day of the Battle of Bosworth Field. He claimed the throne by judgment of God in battle, otherwise known as right of conquest, and title of inheritance. Remember, Henry kinda had a blood right to his crown, so claiming that it was God's doing was really important to securing his throne. In terms of Henry's reign, his coronation was on October 30th, 1485. He tried to hail his kingship as a new start for the country, as he had to make England prosperous again after the long, tedious, and destructive wars. Henry kept his promise and married Elizabeth of York on January 18th, 1486. This marriage marked the end of the feud between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the Tudor emblem, a white and red rose. This marriage also gave their children a legitimate claim to the throne. On top of this, Henry had Parliament repeal Titulus Regius, which in 1484 had declared the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and thus their children, Elizabeth of York, invalid. By repealing it, Henry legitimized his wife. Henry greatly diminished the power of the nobility, unheard of, I know, to try to decrease personal armies and internal tension. Henry was also relatively financially aware, but that'll cause some problems for him later. Henry was always prepared for war. He met with Parliament 7 times, but wanted to try and maintain the peace. Henry and Elizabeth had 8 children, 4 of whom survived past early childhood: Arthur Tudor, Margaret, Henry VIII, and Mary. Despite all of this parliamentary action and right of conquest, etc., Henry's throne was still not as secure as he wanted it to be. Several active rebellions took place, the first of which was called the Stafford and Lovell Rebellion. Led by Francis Lovell and Sir Humphrey Stafford, this rebellion hoped to restore the Yorkish monarchy. It was dispelled quickly when Henry learned of it, however, did not dissuade other rebellions. Lambert Simnel posed a greater threat to Henry's reign in 1487, when he pretended to be Edward, Earl of Warwick. He was one of many conspiracies against Henry to try and restore Yorkish rule. Simnel had a large support, with about 2,000 German mercenaries on his side. Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, and the Earl Lincoln John de la Pole also sided with him. The rebellion ended with the Battle of Stoke in June of 1487. Lincoln was killed, while the other leaders either disappeared or were imprisoned. Henry spared Simnel, assuming he was being used by Lincoln and Margaret as a figurehead. Simnel was not the only case of false identity, and pretenders of the royal family, including some to be princes of the Tower, remember them, plagued Henry VII for the majority of his reign. Henry died on April 21st, 1509 from TB, about 6 years after the death of his wife. He was succeeded by Henry VIII. A relatively big problem with regard to Henry's reputation is the lack of evidence of Henry's personal and early life. Rarely are there direct quotes or writings from him. This means that the legacy is almost fully in the hands of other people. Sir Francis Bacon, yes, the scientific method guy, wrote an incredibly influential view on Henry VII, despite some historical inaccuracies, in his book The History of the Reign of King Henry VII, and is still quoted today by those both in favour and against Henry. This history remained the main source of information on Henry VII for hundreds of years, despite not actually being a primary source. If for some reason you want a widely accredited and, in my opinion, much better history of Henry VII, I would recommend S.B. Crimes's novel Henry VII. He also refutes several of Bacon's arguments and common myths about Henry, along with just providing a really good in-depth view of Henry's reign. At the same time, the win at the Battle of Bosworth was sometimes portrayed as close to myth, with Richard II representing the evil king and Henry the good hero. On a side note, if you want to talk about histories and reputations, definitely check out Richard III. There's a lot of really interesting arguments about what kind of a guy he really was. But time hasn't been the best to Henry's reputation. Despite his relatively peaceful reign and transforming England once again into a prosperous nation, he's often thought of as a miser king, one who hoards money. That's what being cautious gets you. I'm joking. Please be smart with your money. Few, however, deny Henry's brilliance/wit. Polydore Virgil, an Italian historian, wrote on Henry VII after his death. He wrote, quote, "Henry VII was gracious and kind, and he was as attentive to his visitors as he was easy of access. He was most fortunate in war, although he was more inclined to peace. He cherished justice above all things." End quote. Virgil acknowledges, however, how damaging the potential corruption is/was to Henry's name. Quote, "But all these virtues were obscured latterly by avarice. In a monarch it may be considered the worst vice, since it is harmful to everyone." End quote. Although Henry VII is arguably one of the most successful English monarchs, he is one of the least well known. However, many agree that the vivid reigns of Henry VIII, Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth I would not have been possible without the grinding and prudent government of the first Tudor king. I hope this was a little bit interesting. See y'all next time. Bye.